All right, welcome back to our Extra AI podcast series. And today we have an interesting conversation. I have with me uh, the Chief Product Officer of U.com, Saurabh. Saurabh, welcome on board.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right, so just a brief background about Saurabh. Saurabh brings a very interesting combination of product leadership, applied AI, search, discovery, trust, and a lot of things. And I believe we will go into some of those background that Saurabh brings into the table. So before we get started, Saurabh, I always start the podcast conversation with an interesting story or a personal backstory or a professional backstory about how you ended up here doing what you're doing currently.
Yeah, that's a great question. Uh, you know, I joined Google about 15 years ago, and I really fell in love with that mission, right? Organize the world's information, make it universally accessible. And it's such a great mission, and I think it's taken on renewed urgency in the time of, where we see AI and agents all going. That mission has never been more needed than it is today, with what you see today happening, where, the CEO of Cloudflare announced 2 weeks ago that for the first time in history, agents now crawl and surf the web more than humans do. And so
Mhm.
that mission is now more and more being driven by agents, including and also humans as well. And
Mhm.
so 3 years ago, when I joined U.com, about 3 years ago now, it was clear that that's what the mission that U.com was working on at that time. And again, in many ways, that's been like the mission through line throughout my career is how do we organize the world's information? How do we make it universally accessible, not just to humans, which is and has been Google's mission, but also to agents, which is really at the heart of U.com's mission today.
Beautiful. Beautiful. So before we get into the conversation, I know we've moved quite a bit, right? We have seen search being evolved from a keyword search or a discovery to now to AI assistance and now to more on the agentic workflows. What is that one particular product or a technology shift you saw very early on and you thought like AI is going to fundamentally change how people find the answers or how people interact with the systems or interact with the information?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we're seeing that play out in real time today, right? There
Mhm.
are, any task where a knowledge worker, it required a significant amount of their time. We're seeing a range of AI companies, we're seeing a range of agents being created that optimize for that. So whether that is building financial models, right? I talk to many of my friends in accounting and they say it builds a great financial model. Many of my
Mhm.
friends in legal, many of my friends in software engineering. And so what I think you see is a continued development of use cases that humans are good at, AI getting to be even better at, and being always on and never get tired. Right? I think you see that emergence coming through in a every day. There's a new company that is being successful in a vertically specialized field, and I think you're going to continue to see that grow.
Beautiful, beautiful. Let's now get into the real meat of our conversation. I would like to first touch base or get into the AI search or basically the new product experiences and other things that we are. I know we have search has evolved quite a bit. We know that in the past it used to be like you, of course, it is still like that. I think you type in a query and then it reviews a list of links. And today we see users increasingly expect a lot of direct answers or a lot of reasoning, and that is how it is evolving, right? I think you just not only just type in something, but it is evolving quite a bit. So in your sense, I think, what do you think the shift, how do you describe this shift from a search engine capacity to answering engine capacity to AI agents? I think this is where I know in a little while we'll get into the background of you.com as well. But the I know since you also come from this Google background, background with Google. So the thing is like evolving from search engines to answering engines to AI agents, because now there is a lot more search being done by the agents.
Yeah, it's a great question. At its heart, what I think you're seeing is that I think you described those evolutions very accurately, and each evolution is a change in the type of work being done. When it was a search engine that was dominant, you would type in a query like, best taqueria in San Francisco. It'd give you 10 blue links, and it was up to you to then go through those blue links and find the answer that you wanted. Okay. Then, 2 or 3 years ago, ChatGPT came out, a variety of other companies came out, and they started becoming an answer engine, which is to say, best taqueria in San Francisco. Well, it's going to give you three places. It's going to say La Taqueria, it's going to say El Farolito. I'm probably making some enemies on this show, but it's basically, it moved into a higher level of answering questions, right? It was no, and so it was doing work for you. It went and looked at those sites. It came back and said, here's, give you the answer. Now, what you're seeing with agents, perhaps to carry this analogy too far, it's no longer giving you answers. It's trying to understand what is your higher level task. And the higher level tasks might be that, I have friends from the East Coast visiting for the weekend and they just want to do a taqueria bar crawl. Well, that's a very different type of, now you can see the level of complexity is moving up, right? And so it may say, well, okay, well, they're going to be here for 3 days. It's best to have taquerias for lunch so that you can digest some of that. Here's three taquerias, very different styles, so that they can give you a variety of things, right? At every shift, what we're seeing is a higher level task being taken off of the plate from humans and being done by AI. And I think you see that, of course, not only with fun examples like Best Taqueria, but you see that in examples of, let's take that financial model, where the accountant is building a financial model, or it's moving from, well, I'm going to build a financial model myself to, okay, build a financial model and then say, okay, actually what I want is I want 10 scenarios based on 10 different input parameters and build a financial model for each of them. Again, what you're seeing is AI moving up and up the value chain, up and up the complexity scheme to not just assist you, but to be able to actually get a high level task done on your behalf.
So this is where I think it's great that you brought us into the enterprise side of the things from a consumer side of the things, because this is where things are evolving quite rapidly and quite fast. Because here employees are not just, I think I will take your example a little more further. Here in the enterprise world, employees do not just want the information, but they also want quick decisions or quick summaries or quick workflows and so on and so forth. Again, all that in the context of the business that they are doing, in the context of grounded with their data. So in this world, I think where we are moving quite rapidly into this, how do you see this overall AI search and the agents changing the productivity when we talk about the knowledge workers and the enterprise teams? I think you've rightfully brought that example, so I thought like I might want to dive a bit more deeper into that.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about first principles.
Mhm.
From a first principles perspective, if you have only a large language model hooked into your agent without web search, then your large language model is limited. It may be intelligent, but has no understanding of the world outside of its training. And so what we see is even in a trillion parameter model, it's not going to suck up the entire world's worth of information. That's for various reasons inefficient. So not only does it not have an understanding of whatever was outside of its training set, anything that happened after its training set, news, sports scores, weather, financial information, any new websites that created after it, it doesn't have a sense of. And so for some use cases, that's totally fine, right? If you're using if your large language model, your agent is helping you with complex financial calculations, that's probably fine. You don't need that outside information to actually go ahead and complete your model. But let's take an example of, we work with many news publishers that they will have a fact-checking agent. And that fact-checking agent needs to know what's happening in the real world post-training. So, for
Mhm.
example, you could say, who's the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom? It's Keir Starmer today, but he just announced his resignation. There'll be a new Prime Minister in a few weeks. Well, if I'm writing a fact-checking agent and I say that Keir Starmer resigned and there'll be a new Prime Minister in a few weeks, if that fact-checking agent was trained with GPT 5.5, is using GPT 5.5 and
Mhm.
no web agent, web search capabilities, it won't know that that's the case and it'll say that's incorrect. There's no plans for Keir
Right.
Starmer to resign. And then that's actually going to take away how trusted that agent is because it doesn't have access to modern information, current information. Same thing. Uh, if you ask GPT 5.5 without web search, when will SpaceX IPO? It'll say that there's no current plans for SpaceX's IPO. It doesn't have that information because it simply wasn't part of its training set or wasn't available, hadn't happened yet at time of its training. And so fundamentally, if you're building an agent that needs access to the outside world for a variety of reasons, you work with a web search tool. Sometimes it's the ones that are built by OpenAI and Anthropic. Other times you'll go to something with you.com. What we find is that companies that have a significant part of their agents' needs being web information, they'll end up using us uh, for higher accuracy within certain domains, more enterprise readiness, better cost effectiveness, total cost of ownership on a number of dimensions.
Beautiful. Beautiful. So, this is where I think the context of the information is getting even more important. It's not just the current information that you have. We have to get into the overall web search and get more context about what is currently happening out there. This is
Yeah.
very, very realistic and very much needed for this. I want to dive a bit more deeper into this business context, right? I think the business problems enterprises are facing, and we see some of these problems uh, kind of get much more bigger. I think we see a lot of these enterprises are facing issues when they try to use AI assistants or agents in real business workflows. Is the issue mostly because of the model capability or the data access, or do you think governance or user experience, or what are, or is this something completely different? Because here in your conversations, what do you see the biggest challenges these enterprises are facing when they are using these AI assistants or agents in real business workflows?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. There's many different things going on. Every enterprise is a little bit different. Let
Mhm.
me talk through some themes that I see, and sometimes they're contradictory themes. Let's talk about what's very trendy in the news these days. I'm spending too much on AI, right?
Mhm.
You've heard that from Uber's CTO, those type of things. And what's interesting, I think of it as somewhat contradictory because there are two things that are going on. Number one is lots of organizations are being tasked with saying, implement AI at all costs and figure out where it's productive. We'll figure out where it's productive later. But if you do that in a very large organization and you say, hey, every one of Uber's engineers can now has an unlimited AI budget. Well, they're going to try lots of different things. And so what you see is correctly a company like Uber exploring what I call the capability overhang. The capabilities of these models are still not fully well understood in real world applications. And so it makes sense to have 10,000 engineers at Uber exploring all of the different possibilities. But if you do that in an unchecked way, well, you've got 10,000 people exploring things whose ROI is unproven, and you
Mhm.
get stuck with a bill at the end of the quarter, and you say, what did I get for it? And so I think that companies are struggling with exploring that capability overhang, which is in their best interest, but how to do so before clear ROI is known and present, which is what you hear from Uber CTO, that they spent their year's budget by April or May or whatever it might have been. And there are many ways to address this, right? Do you put governance controls in place? Do you have a small tiger team that is re-envisioning your product from AI first and ground up, and they can experiment within a fixed budget and a fixed capability? Do you have other teams that are focusing on incremental improvements that are more bounded, right? I think that we're graduating into this world of if I felt like in Q4 and Q1, the goal was use as much AI as possible. You saw that from companies like Facebook, others, and everybody's pulling back from that to say it now is shifting to use it responsibly in terms of measuring ROI, those type of things. So I think that that paradox is one thing that is slowing things down. But from a completely different dimension, I think that there are also other things. What I just talked about were two very AI forward organizations, right? Meta
Hmm.
and Uber. The vast majority of the United States is still not doing much more with AI than uh, they're still in the answers faster phase, right? That second evolution you described earlier in the call, right? They use
Hmm.
it to make an email snappier, right? They make use it to maybe summarize something that is long form otherwise. And I think that there, if you look at industry more broadly, the challenge isn't how do you balance exploring the capability overhang with, managing your budget. It is getting people to use it in the first place. And I think that is the typical, I think we in Silicon Valley just assume everybody's using it.
Right, right.
My family lives in Western Pennsylvania. When I go to Western Pennsylvania, there's a little bit of AI talk. There's a lot of AI talk. But how many companies are actually switching themselves to be AI first as a deep priority? Far more
Hmm.
limited than what you hear about in the Valley, right? And so I think things in some ways are following an accelerated product adoption curve, but it is
Hmm.
still a product adoption curve. And what you see is large swaths of American industry still at the early phases of the answers-based revolution and not even thinking about the agent-based evolution. And I think that's the typical, well, let's see, some companies are going to be more on that bleeding edge. Some companies are going to say, well, we're going to wait to see ROI. And some companies will say, well, it works well enough. And until an incumbent comes in and until somebody comes in and disrupts us, we're just not going to worry about it. Those aren't novel situations with AI. Those are typical product adoption type of feedback that you see. And I think American industry is following it in the AI world, just as it has in previous technologies, albeit with perhaps a little bit more of a timer ticking.
Hmm. Hmm. I think you raised some two very valid and very important points, right? I think, which is one, uh, the problem is on the two sides. I think some organizations, I think they have been given this task of come up with something like we are giving you X number of tokens or X number of usage, and then that has now kind of drawn back because there is many of these big firms are now understanding that it's not that giving the employees the option to use this and come up with some use cases, but it's more like how you can generally create more productivity or generally create more context in what you're trying to answer. So this is where I think you're getting right. You're getting into this answer-based evaluation. We are still in that answer-based evaluation rather than
Yes.
agent-based evaluation, and we will be getting to that agent-based evaluation at some point of time. Are we as product leaders? I think if we have to think as product leaders, what are those some mistakes that we are doing? I know you have highlighted some things, but you've really differentiated that very well between the answer-based evaluation to the agent-based evaluation. Are we over focusing more on the model and under focusing on the product design, workflows, evaluation, or overall user trust itself?
Yeah. Yeah, but maybe to expand on that, I really think that there's actually four revolutions. The first is
Mhm.
answers, and Raghu, you've described that well. The next is Copilot, right, where I'm drafting strategy documents together with AI. The third is agents, where it's taking tasks off of my plate, but I'm still in the loop. And the fourth is autonomous agents, right, where I'm not in the loop at all. And if you look at Twitter, it feels like the entire world is on autonomous agents. But in reality, most of the world has gotten to the answers part of it. And most folks are looking now to get onto the co-pilot phase.
Mhm.
And very few folks, there was actually a study done, 20 to 30% of companies are even thinking about an agent strategy, and less than 5% are actually thinking about an autonomous agent strategy. And I think to answer your broader question, Raghu, when you think about that, why are I think about when I think broadly about AI adoption, I think more about how do I get people to move from answers to copilot? Because if they can do that, you're not going to skip from answers to agents because you need that copilot phase to almost understand what is an agent capable of.
Mhm.
Answers has become easy because it's ubiquitous. Now, when I open up, if you use Google, which is everybody, you use answers. And people now understand that. Google's, I think, has done a great job in rolling it out thoughtfully and methodically, right? Their AI overview, which is essentially answers. It's now on my Safari browser, on my Chrome browser, everywhere I go. And so I think a lot about getting it to the Copilot phase. And today, I think what you're also seeing is that in 2024 and 2025, the story was OpenAI can do everything. ChatGPT can do anything, and to some degree, Claude. And what you see with Claude now, where they put out Claude Code, right? Then they put out Claude Design.
Right.
That is them essentially understanding that to get people into that co-pilot phase, they have to build custom products that appeal to certain verticals. You also see that outside of the major labs with companies like Harvey, companies like Hebbia, right? Focusing on legal verticals, focusing on finance verticals. And those companies are doing extraordinarily well because they're saying, we're going to take a particular workflow and go very deep with it, as opposed to hoping that our users will become prompt engineering experts in this particular vertical. And they're finding that harness, right? A lot of people use this word harness, whether it's a coding harness, whether it's a finance harness. That harness is where a lot of the human value lies because humans are busy and simply don't have time to understand or time to infinitely prompt and figure out how can I use AI, right? And to go back to that tension you mentioned, I do think that the Twitterverse has an ability to focus on what's new, right? New is like Twitter's favorite food, right? It's what Twitter gets fed on. New models, uh, new releases, that type of stuff. But in many ways, the AI revolution is starting to look a lot to end users at enterprises. It's starting to look a lot like the SaaS revolution before it, where people are building vertically specific workflows. Descript AI is another company that comes to mind, video editing, right?
Mhm.
And making it so that those vertically driven workflows are rethought up from the ground up with AI.
Mhm.
And that appeals to people because it's saying, here's your workflow, here's what you do every day. Click a button, click a couple buttons, enter a couple words in, and we're going to make it 10 times faster. That is a far more appealing product story than here's a box and figure out how to use that box, right? Because people don't have the time to figure it out. And so to I think you're seeing companies focusing on that capability overhang by creating vertically specific harnesses that are finding appeal. And what's really nice about those vertically specific harnesses is that the model almost doesn't matter, right? You plug in, it does matter. It absolutely does matter. But the models are getting so powerful now that the real issue is becoming, can people understand how to use it? And those companies are getting better at it because they're not competing with the models directly. Whenever a new model comes in, they just get better and that they
Mhm.
understand the workflow of their users. And it creates a nice cycle for them, right? Where they understand their workflows, they understand the models, and it creates this cycle where their harness is getting better over time because they understand both of those pieces really well.
True, true. I think it's uh, interesting that you brought this mm, concept or this aspect of vertical hardness, because I think that is one topic which is being discussed quite a bit, because it's not about, like you mentioned, not about the model that you're using, but how well you can use these models interchangeably in the context of a workflow that you're fitting it, that you're building in particular, maybe a vertical centric scenario, top to bottom. And this is where I think you might end up using two models or three models, but how do you
Absolutely.
get them
Yeah,
together and make it work? Yeah.
absolutely. What we're seeing is that the most sophisticated agents, there's an interesting debate. I was we were just talking about this internally, actually. A lot of actually, we just published, with LangChain, a blog post around building sophisticated economic analysis agents. You
Hmm.
can find it on u.com/blogs. But what was interesting there was, to your point, we took a multi-agent approach there, right? Where there was an orchestrator agent and then a bunch of sub-agents that fanned out to do work on behalf of the orchestrator agent. And what's really interesting is if you design it correctly, you can design it in a way that is optimizing for accuracy, latency, and cost. And there's an interesting debate around, well, should the orchestrator agent be the Opus class model? And should the sub-agents be the Haiku class models, right?
Hmm.
Internally, what we're seeing is that it's actually the opposite, where the orchestrator agent should be the relatively simple agent.
Simply.
And the sub-agents doing the work with the actual data are potentially like the Opus class models as well. It's not clear to me whether that type of scenario applies to every complex agent system, but
Hmm.
it's an example of how, we're mixing many models, many classes of models to be able to get different types of work done with high accuracy, high latency, sorry, not high latency, low latency,
Right.
and low total cost of ownership. There's also the small language model debate, right, where we use small language models in our core search capabilities exhaustively, because you don't
Hmm.
need to spin up, even a basic haiku model to do certain types of analysis in a domain specific small language model that's highly trained and uh, highly trained for a particular use case can be the most cost effective, high accuracy solution.
Right, right. So let me now kind of get a bit more context into u.com. I know you've already mentioned a few times about u.com, but let's talk a bit more about how the u.com and the u.com platform is approaching this next generation of AI powered search. I know you, u.com is predominantly positioned as a AI powered search for answers and agents. And I think you beautifully laid out the four revolutions that are happening, from answer based revolution to copilot revolution to agent revolution to autonomous agents. I think this is how it has to get in.
Mhm.
Can you give us an overview of u.com's high level vision and mission today? And who are the primary users or customers you're building for? Is it mainly the industry knowledge workers, the developers, the enterprises, or all of the above, or so on and so forth? Can you give a bit of a
Yeah,
background? I just want to, yeah.
yeah, great question. Our mission is simple. We want to create the best web search infrastructure for agents. And what we found is that agents need a variety of tools. Sometimes it's as simple as take a web page and give me its contents. Sounds simple, but when you have complex JavaScript to untangle, it becomes complicated. When you have 30 pages of PDFs with handwriting, it becomes complicated. So that's one class of products. Another class of products says, given a query, return the most relevant websites. That's our web search API. And another class of products says, my data needs are very web bound, and I don't want to create an agent. I would rather utilize your agents that you've built to optimize accuracy, latency, cost for web bound tasks. And that's our research APIs and our finance research API derivative. So depending on, and agents have other needs. We may release new products based on those needs, but those three primitives, those
Mhm.
three APIs seem to cover a wide variety of the needs that we see today. Uh, Forgive me, I've forgotten your second question. And I think you mentioned, what's our mission, but also, what was the second part of the question?
So I was saying, like, who are the primary
Ah,
users?
that's right.
Like a
Yeah.
bunch of
Yeah.
different categories, right? Yeah.
Today we see, at the end of the day, it's developers, but
Mhm.
developers take on three different varieties, right? What you first find is, in no particular order, uh, you find individual developers. These are hobbyists, these are open source enthusiasts, these are people building their own small company, startups, that type of stuff. It's that's a particular type of developer. They have a particular type of need. They're usually hyper fixated on accuracy, latency, total cost of ownership. Then you have an enterprise developer. And sometimes there's an overlap there. And that's really nice when that works out that way. And of course, the enterprise developer is also focused on accuracy, latency, total cost of ownership. But they're also thinking about this as part of a bigger picture, a part of a bigger system. And they have to think about reliability, SLAs, compliance, all sorts of legal topics, that type of thing. They're usually not the decision maker, so they're in that type of situation. You not only have the developer, who ideally is your champion, but you may have a chief technology officer or a head of product, somebody else that actually makes the decision. And then
Mhm.
sometimes you also have finance involved as well. So that's the enterprise developer, the enterprise motion is a separate motion. Uh, and while some of the basics apply, it tends can be a more sophisticated, I shouldn't say more sophisticated, a more involved motion.
Right.
And your third ICP, which is the one that's emerging, is agents. What we're
Mhm.
seeing is agents are more and more often, still the minority, but more and more often making decisions on behalf of users about which web search APIs to use. We see them similarly to developers, right? They care uh, about ease of use. They care about accuracy. They care about latency. They care about total cost of ownership. And so API ergonomics, those type of things matter a lot for that agent class. So those are the three ICPs that we think about. At their core, they care about the same things, but the motion is different. And so we do different things to appeal to those different segments.
Great, great. I think I like the way you've mentioned about the vision and the mission, where you're moving into this agent-based search and agent-based search, and of course, the three ICPs that you have mentioned, where you're the individual developers for the startups, and then of course the enterprise grade, and then the agent-based APIs. I want to get a bit more into this enterprise related aspect, right? I think you mentioned uh, this is where compliance, standards, regulation, and all these kind of things become much more interesting and much more important. Of course, security and other things. So, in this kind of an enterprise AI related ICP or related search, how do you or what does it mean to make the AI search and agent infrastructure truly enterprise ready? Because I
Yeah,
think you might be getting some of these questions, right, in your interactions with the enterprise firms.
yeah, great questions. Look, let's start with the basics, right?
Right.
And often a lot flows from there. Enterprises want to see that this product is going to operate well for their users. And so, very simple statement. But even that simple statement is complicated. The first thing that we think about is how do we measure whether it's operating well or not? And so, what we found the eval, just like in developing models, developing other tools, we found the eval to be the lingua franca of our conversation with enterprises, where it's very helpful to create a custom eval. What does your workload look like? Different workloads have vastly different accuracy profiles, have vastly different ownership profile, total cost of ownership profiles, have vastly different latency profiles. And so in many ways, our SLA is starting to look more like an eval, where what we say is, okay, great, let's choose 500 questions, either synthetic questions that you think users will ask, or based off of a sample of real world questions you see in your product. Have an expert score, we will feed it into the system powered by U.com's web search APIs, and then have an expert grade those answers, and that there'll be an SLA, right? How
Mhm.
many factual hard errors do you see, right? How many soft errors do you see? A hard error is like a true hallucination. A soft error is perhaps it's a grammatical error or something else that might be off, right?
Mhm.
And that we will think about what will happen is that we will agree upon that SLA, and almost always within 3 months the eval set will change because what they thought was going to happen has changed as their users got used to the product, changed their query types as it expanded out. And so it comes back to that eval question around how do we show that the system is accurate or not accurate, and how do we help them with accuracy issues? Sometimes it comes from, and this is where observability is critical. Uh, Sometimes, especially in a complex system with multiple agents, multiple tools, that type of system, sometimes the error does come from U.com's web search APIs. It's good to know. We can address it. Sometimes it comes at different layers of the agent architecture. That's helpful to for our customer to understand. But to zoom out, that eval set is this very critical lingua franca. It not only helps with accuracy, it is a SLA of sorts, and it's something that we can continue to come back to. But that's a very much a conversation developer to developer.
Mhm.
Um, we have to think through, when it comes to enterprise customers, it starts to look a lot like typical enterprise software deals. What are our SLAs? What are your uptime guarantees? What are your compliance? Are you SOC 2 compliant? Of course. Are you HIPAA compliant? FedRAMP, all these things that come up. Uh, then there is also, simple things. Again, this sounds very, I think that the high level answer is it starts to look a lot like traditional SaaS type of deals, right? For example, billing and monitoring, right? Do you have separate roles for developers versus our finance team, which is going to come in there, versus accounts payable, which is actually going to take care of payments, right? And so uh, you've got to look at this. Not, I think it's an interesting merge between AI specifics, things that are
Mhm.
new to the AI era, like eval sets, uh, to some degree observability, and things that are similar to enterprise deals of the past, right? As a compliance, um, account management, SLAs, those type of things that come into typical type of SaaS types of deals.
Mhm. Mhm. Beautiful, beautiful. I think let's get into at this point of time. I want to get into we for confidentiality purposes, we don't need to get into the specific names of the customers or names of the um, public. We can go into the publicly shareable information, but if you can lay out an end-to-end example of how you can run through this in the context of like where this real-time web intelligence or these AI search APIs uh, can realistically improve a business workflow in the
Yeah.
context of an enterprise end-to-end process or something like that.
Yeah, great question. I'll just actually talk about one of the case studies that we received or
Right,
released
right.
last week. So we have a startup, and they focus on helping sales teams become more effective. Right. A typical story is, at the start of a quarter, a sales rep receives 200 leads, and they're told to go off and figure it out. Right. And it's data sitting in Salesforce. There's a lot of information there. And what this company that we work with did was that they wanted to fundamentally reshape the way that sales teams can triage and optimize where they spend their time. And so what they had built is this complex multi-system agent that takes a look at, the Salesforce information, the 200 leads that a sales rep gets, right? And what it will do is it will, amongst other things, to enrich its information, it will utilize the U.com research API and for all 200 of those targets that a sales rep might get. And the U.com Research API will look at all sorts of information, right? Modern company, updated company firmographics, leadership team, the size of it, its latest press releases, all of this information to understand what would be interesting for that sales rep, right? Of the 200 companies, which companies actually might be interested in their product based on what they've announced, right?
Mhm.
How many of these companies fit into that target market range, right? As opposed to relying on old data. And what they have found is by taking this information, they can create a much more accurate triage list that shows a higher return on that sales rep's time. As opposed to shotgunning 200 accounts, it helps them triage the top 10% of accounts to go after with extremely up-to-date information on what this company is doing, where they might be a fit, and triaging it appropriately for the customer rep to go after. It's a great example of the research API. This is a
Mhm.
highly web dependent task, right? Where what is being done on the web, the data from the web is a big part of helping triage what's actually happening. And so this company decided to use our research API, amongst its other secret sauce, to help it create a competitive solution in the market and create real return on investment for companies' sales reps and by time spent. So again, it's a great example of using AI for a
Mhm.
real world use case to actually create return on investment that is measurable. Basically, they can look at, well, how many quality conversions did their sales rep get before and after? Now, there's always going to be a little bit of an art, but a lot of companies can tell when there's a step function change, which this technology is allowing in this particular use case.
Beautiful, beautiful. I know it took me a while to get to this point in this conversation to bring up. I term this as the extra AI question, or the $1 million or the $1 billion question. That's how I kind of frame it. I know this AI search and the agent space is moving very fast. Right? And there are a lot of course, as you already mentioned, there are a lot of bigger players too over here. And there's a lot of course, we have these frontier model companies out there as well. How does U.com differentiate itself, and what do you believe will matter most in this space for a long-term success? And how do
Yeah,
you, yeah,
it's a great question. Ultimately, what I see emerging is essentially a supply and demand marketplace where you have demand for information from agents and you have supply of information from the wide web, right? And so when you think about supply and demand marketplaces, what you end up seeing is that access to supply, you see essentially you have to think about it as a two-sided market, right? How can we increase demand and how can we ensure supply, right? Increasing demand, that is a typical growth playbook. And while there are certain I think that there are certain choke points, right? The model labs, some of the agent platforms, those type of things. It's less of a kind of a it's a distribution game and you've got to work hard at it, right? The supply one is equally interesting, right? Where what you're starting to see is folks starting to think about blocking off their content from the web, right? Because they don't want agents to access it, or it's not that they don't want agents to access it, it's that they want agents to actually pay for it. And so because an agent isn't going to sign up for a Wall Street Journal subscription the same way that a human might have, and that was a return on value for indexing in the past. And so I think what's really interesting to think about is the content supply game and how you think about um, ensuring that to be a continually growing piece of the pie here.
beautiful, beautiful. I know we are almost at the end of the conversation, but uh, before I let you go, I have a couple of other questions. Really great having this conversation with you. So, how do you see the future of AI and its applications over the next few years in this rapidly evolving agents and agent search space? Uh, any thoughts that you would like to bring it up?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things I think about in several different dimensions here. First and foremost, I think you're going to start to see over the next year or two that the companies that fully embrace AI and are moving, forget about it whether they're building AI
Right.
tools or AI software or not. I think the companies in any industry that fully embrace AI, you're going to start to see them run away with it because there's
Mhm.
going to be such a clear productivity difference between those that have fully embraced it versus those that don't, right? So that I think that's one thing that we're going to see. We're already starting to see it. Number two, I think that you're going to continue to see the rise of vertically specific AI. Again, going back to that capability overhang, people don't understand when they go to ChatGPT or Claude. If you're in any field, unless you somehow have a ton of experience in prompt engineering and are willing to create extremely complicated Claude skills, it doesn't come naturally or obviously how that box that's on ChatGPT or Claude can fundamentally improve your performance, your productivity. And so I think you'll continue to see the rise of vertically specific AI tools. that continue to grow. And it's going to look a lot like the SaaS markets of the past, in my opinion. I do think that models will continue to push those companies to defend their space,
Mhm.
as you know, things that I could do, things that required a SaaS subscription, are I'm just like, I'm just going to do it in ChatGPT today. I'm just going to do it in Claude today. But I do think that it will be a continued durable moat for deeply understanding a workflow and making it intuitive to use through AI. And I think that you're going to see that continued rise of businesses there. One maybe other hot take that I sometimes talk about is, uh, I think that there is a reckoning happening around the use of frontier models versus open weight models. And I think you're going to start to see a lot. I think you'll always see use cases for the cutting edge, but I think you're going to see a lot of workflows graduate from the cutting edge to say, hey, well, look, this model class does this just perfectly fine. And that at that point, you'll see that those workloads will move to open weight models because of the dramatic cost savings that you can see while maintaining quality as well.
Beautiful. I like the way that you have put the future takeaways. Great having you on our podcast today, Saurabh. Any highlights or any key takeaways that you would like the audience to go away with?
Yeah, if
When we
you're, I'll put a plug in. So
Mhm.
if you're building agents today, take a look at you.com. Our web search APIs, our research API, our contents API, they're best in class in the industry. We'd love for you to try it out. If it works, great. If it doesn't, let us know what you found to be subpar. We're hard at work at fixing these things and would love your feedback.
Great chatting with you, Saurabh. I really love the conversation and the great insights that you have provided in the context of how this space is evolving, the agent search and the agent search space.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.